For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Morning.
This last week, the anniversary of Nelson Mandela's death was marked by pledges to honor his legacy. What do you think of the way Mandela was remembered?
You see, when you say you pledge yourself to honor his legacy in the singular, it implies, it's obvious what the legacies of Mandela are. In fact, they don't use the plural. They talk of it as being, as if it's obvious. And I think one of the difficulties I have with the way in which Mandela has been remembered is that people have never really engaged, or not people, but most politicians, public heritage people, don't really engage with the meanings of his life, and they're quite complex. Mandela was not one person. He changed a lot. He had multiple identities. The Mandela who grew up in Timberland was not the same one as the Mandela on the Rand. And in the early days on the Rand, he was like a country bumpkin. He didn't know his way around there. Luckily for him, he met up with Sisulu, and a relative took him to see Walter Sisulu, and he was amazed. He'd never seen African with a typist. Sisulu was an estate agent. It's quite hard to imagine him being in business, but anyway, he was a estate agent, and he organized, because of the contacts that he had with lawyers as an estate agent, he organized for Mandela to get articles as a lawyer, as an attorney. It was very hard for Africans to get articles as an attorney, and he used his contact to do this. Mandela, when he went there, first of all, was very impressed with the typist's fingers going all over the keyboard, but he was also impressed with Sisulu's command of English. And after he left there, he asked someone, where did Sisulu study? Now, you know, Sisulu only had up to standard 2 at that point. And the man said he studied in the University of Life. And it was quite an important thing, because Mandela had by then almost got his BA from Fort Hare, and he met this man who, through his experience in life, was very, very wise already, although he was only a few years older than Mandela. Anyway, Mandela at that stage was really, knew very little about the city, but in the course of working with people in the law firm that he joined, he became politicized. But Sisulu also politicized him. And he learned very quickly. He was eager to read, to learn. And Mandela was one of those who was involved in the founding of the Youth League. But even then, Mandela didn't know much compared with the others. But as I say, he was intense. He applied himself. He met with people, and he learnt about various things, and he soon became something of a hothead. What was important about the relationship with Sisulu, even though Sisulu was involved in the angry young men of the Youth League, Sisulu was always mature and slow to make decisions. Mandela was very quick. And when the Youth League had anti-white, anti-communist, anti-Indian positions, Mandela was one of those who used to break up meetings of the Communist Party and the Youth League. He said in one speech that Sisulu was not always reliable for those things. And so, you know, it was a very important relationship, because one could almost say that without a Sisulu, there would not have been a Mandela who became a leader. Sisulu says on YouTube, there's one of these interviews with him, he says, we wanted to establish a national movement. one day a leader of a national movement walked into my office. Now, obviously Mandela was not a leader yet, but he had a sense that this man had potential. And over those years of the 50s, Mandela became much more militant, politically aware. He was the chief defier in the Defiance campaign. And when he qualified as a lawyer, he had this image of being, on the one hand, tough, because he trained in a boxing gym every day. So he was a boxer. But he also wore very fashionable clothes. George Bezos describes going into some tailor near the Johannesburg Country Club, and this white man is on his knees measuring Nelson Mandela for a suit. So he had this image of, on the one hand, being tough, but on the other hand, being fashionable. The fact that he was fashionable did not lead Mandela to have contempt for the poor. The late Ruth Mompati worked in the firm with Tambo and Mandela, and she describes how when people used to come from the rural areas about their cases, Mandela and Tambo would sit and listen for hours and hours and hours. They were not rushing them. You know, most lawyers rush you because they think, oh, this is not relevant, the court's not going to hear this and all that. But they were interested because they were people's lawyers. Also, Zakes Mda, the famous author, his father was in the Youth League, and he describes how sometimes they used to spend, the kids, Mda kids used to spend a weekend or something with Mandela's, and one day they're driving at the back of this fancy Oldsmobile, whatever it is that Mandela's driving, and they pass an old croc, Skoro car on the road, and the kids start laughing. Mandela turns round and he gives them hell, and he says, "What car do you own?" You know? And so what he was teaching the kids is you must not have contempt for the poverty of others. Also, this thing of being a boxer is quite an important part of his imagery. There is an interview that I read where a man who was a waiter in the 50s serving people, and the people he's serving know that he reads the newspapers. So they say to him, "What is in the newspapers today?" So he says, they say Mandela will be in court today. So the people say, "Mandela will give the Boers a clap and knock them out." So the imagery of Mandela, the boxer, was actually very much in people's minds. He was seen as a tough man. But Mandela was able to change. He was often reprimanded in the 1950s for jumping the gun, with suggesting that people must take armed struggle even before it was adopted, similar things. But he was able to adapt, and especially when he went to jail, he thought about whether it was possible to win a war against the apartheid regime, whether there was a way out of this other than fighting it out. And that is why he came to the conclusion that it was necessary to talk to the enemy and to secure a negotiated settlement in order to secure peace and to secure freedom. So Mandela, and all the things he did related to that, like meet Betsy Verwoerd, wear the Springbok rugby jersey, all of these things were part of ways of ensuring that the peace would succeed. So the Mandela, when we say we're going to honor Mandela, it's not one person. We need to honor him as someone who was able to adapt to a range of circumstances, who was militant, but also willing to compromise, if that compromise would secure the freedom of the people. And what people don't understand sometimes is that compromise is not a swear word. Compromise may be necessary in order to reach the main goals.
And a new generation has emerged that seems to blame Mandela for the lack of change in their lives, suggesting that he sold out the struggle in 1994. What do you think of this trend?
See, it's a trend which is not based on a careful reading of the context of the settlement of 1994, which was not Mandela's settlement alone. All of us who were in the leadership of the ANC at the time used to meet in town, 6 o'clock in the morning, in the National Working Committee of the ANC. We would discuss what is it that we were going to do, or that the negotiators were going to do, and then we would approve those things or not approve those things. So that the context in which the settlement of 1994 was arrived at was not one where the enemy was on his knees, suing for peace, surrendering. You had an enemy that was quite capable of continuing to fight, and in fact, when they were fighting, it was not soldiers who were dying. They were massacring communities, as in Boipatong. They were killing people on the trains. Oliver Tambo once said, for the apartheid regime, every black person is a military target. So it was very, very important for the people of South Africa to end the bloodshed. But it was also very important to get the vote and have a democratic constitution. So the reason why Nelson Mandela and others bent every effort in order to secure a constitution and to secure peace was that the main people who were suffering under this constitution, under the conditions prior to the settlement, were actually not the whites, but black people. Now, a lot of people attribute to Mandela a notion of rainbowism and forgiveness at all costs. Personally, I was around at the time. I never heard him talk about these things. I just saw him at Codesa when de Klerk did something that was dishonest. I saw him give de Klerk hell. Now, Mandela wasn't even president of the country. He was just president of the ANC. And he said, you know, even from a president of an illegitimate, immoral regime, we expect some integrity. And he really let de Klerk have it. So that Mandela, if he got angry, if he felt betrayed, it wasn't just a case of we forgive you and all of this sort of stuff. There was tactically sometimes he felt it was necessary to avert a counter-revolution, a sort of revolt of the white generals, a revolt of white people in general, many of whom were very armed. Lots of whites in the rural areas have got arms and they've got dynamite because a lot of them had been working in the mines. Now, you didn't want to have a revolt against a new democratic government. So they did everything possible to ensure that they did not fear majority rule becoming a revenge rule against white people. Now, in that sense, he did try to create a condition for a new society, but there was no fetishization of forgiveness and reconciliation, because Bishop Tutu as well often condemned whites for the way they viewed it as a one-sided process whereby only black people would be generous and extend forgiveness after a process in the TRC. So my view is that the young generation, first of all, they have not studied adequately the context under which the settlement of 1994 was reached, but they also have not adequately understood the legal provisions that are in place. For example, when they speak about just give us back the land, they seem to think that the Constitution is a barrier to distribution of land. Dikgang Moseneke, amongst others, has said very often that the Constitution does not prevent expropriation. Even expropriation without compensation is allowed, provided there is a public justification for it, the public good, and that there needs to be political will. And if you want political will, people who want the land must organize for the land, and they must not batter the memory of someone who is dead. They must activate themselves in the present to achieve those goals.
Thank you, Raymond. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about Mandela's legacies in question.